I have rehearsed this confession for 23 years, and I still don't have the right words for it, so I'll use the plain ones. In the spring of 1994, I found an infant Bigfoot alone in the wilderness of northern Idaho, injured and in what I can only describe as critical condition. I brought it home. I raised it in my house, on my land, for 10 years. I named it, I fed it, I watched it grow from something the size of a large human toddler into something that had to turn sideways to fit through my barn door. I documented every month of its development in journals I still have. I loved it, in the way that you love something that has become the center of your daily existence, that relies on you completely, that teaches you more about what you are by being so profoundly different from you. And then, in the autumn of 2004, its mother came to take it back. My name is Gerald Pratt. I am 61 years old. I own 43 acres outside Elk City, Idaho, backed up to the Clearwater National Forest on 3 sides. I am a retired wildlife rehabilitator, licensed by the state of Idaho for 22 years, specializing in large mammals. I have raised orphaned black bears, mountain lion kittens, wolves, elk calves. I know what it means to take a wild thing into your care and carry the full weight of its survival, and I know what it means to release it, and I know the grief of both. Nothing in 22 years of wildlife rehabilitation prepared me for what I am about to describe. Not the biology, not the emotional labor, not the ethical complexity, not the sheer physical reality of sharing a property with a being that was, by the time its mother arrived, larger than any animal I had ever worked with and far more aware of what was happening than any animal I had ever worked with. What most people don't understand is that I am not sharing this story to justify what I did. I made decisions that I have interrogated every day for 23 years, and I will not pretend they were all correct. What I am sharing it for is simpler and harder than justification. I am sharing it because it happened, because it changed me at a level I am still discovering, and because the creature I raised for 10 years and the creature who came to reclaim it deserved to be witnessed accurately, without the distortions of legend or sensationalism. They were real. They were extraordinary. They were nothing like the stories. It was May 14th, 1994, a Thursday. I remember the day of the week because I had been planning to spend Thursday servicing my truck, and instead I spent it making a decision that restructured the next decade of my life. I had been 3 days into a solo survey of the National Forest boundary on my eastern property line, a routine I performed every spring to document any encroachment or habitat change. The terrain on that side of my land rises steeply into a section of old-growth Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir that the Forest Service had never formally assessed for wildlife use, and which I had, over 12 years on that property, come to understand as more ecologically active than its official status suggested. The morning of May 14th was cold and overcast, with the specific quality of late spring in the northern Rockies. The snow gone from everything below 4,000 feet, but still visible on the higher slopes, the undergrowth just beginning to come up, the light flat and even in the way that makes distances hard to judge. I heard the sound before I saw anything. I want to describe it carefully because it is important. It was not a cry in the way a distressed animal cries. It was lower than that, more rhythmic, with a quality that I initially and incorrectly attributed to a bird. A sustained, soft pulsing, not a call for help, but the sound of something maintaining itself against exhaustion. Something keeping itself present through repetition. I moved toward it slowly, with the trained caution of someone who has had enough encounters with distressed large mammals to know that the animal in trouble is often the most dangerous animal in the area. What I found, in a shallow depression at the base of a large spruce, was something I had no framework for. It was approximately the size of a large human 2-year-old. I estimated 25 to 30 pounds, but the proportions were different. The limbs were longer relative to the body. The hands were larger, even accounting for scale. The face was broader, the brow more pronounced, the jaw heavier. It was covered in fine reddish-brown hair, thin enough that the skin showed through on the face and the palms. Its eyes, when it looked up at me, were the amber brown of old wood, and they held, even in distress, the same quality of assessment I had encountered in adult bears. Calculating the situation, deciding on a response. It was injured. The right foreleg, arm I would learn to call it, was twisted at the elbow in a way that suggested a fall or a compression injury. There was no open wound. The injury was orthopedic, not acute. But the infant had clearly been immobile for long enough that dehydration was advanced, and the temperature, 41 degrees Fahrenheit by my field thermometer, was cold enough that hypothermia was a genuine concern. My training took over before my mind could engage with the impossibility of what I was looking at. I assessed the injury. I assessed the dehydration. I assessed the temperature and the exposure time. I looked with the practiced eye of 22 years in wildlife rehabilitation for the mother, for any sign of recent adult presence in the immediate area. I found nothing, no tracks in the soft soil that were not the infant's own small, struggling marks. No scent signature I could identify as a second animal. No disturbed vegetation indicating a large adult had been through. The infant had been alone for a significant period, long enough that waiting for a maternal return was not a defensible option, long enough that leaving it where it was meant, with near certainty that I would find it dead on my next pass. I made the decision in approximately 4 minutes. I have made faster decisions and slower ones. I have never made one that cost me more. I took off my outer jacket, wrapped the infant in it, and carried it home. I will not minimize what the first 72 hours were. I had a wildlife rehabilitation facility on my property, a proper one, licensed and equipped, with holding pens, a treatment area, and the supplies necessary for emergency intervention in large mammal cases. I had IV fluids. I had warming blankets. I had pain management protocols for orthopedic injuries in large primates, specifically for the black bears I had worked with, whose anatomy is not identical to what I was now dealing with, but was, I rapidly determined, close enough to work from. By midnight on May 14th, the infant's core temperature had stabilized, and it was accepting water through a syringe, slowly, suspiciously, but consistently. The elbow injury was, as far as I could determine without imaging equipment, a dislocation rather than a fracture. I reduced it, which required the infant to be restrained, which was the most frightening 15 minutes of that first night, not because the infant was aggressive, but because it was, throughout the entire procedure, watching me with an attention that I could only call purposeful. It seemed to be deciding whether to trust me, while I was causing it significant pain, and it held the question open. I wrote in my journal at 2 in the morning, whatever this is, it is not operating on instinct alone. It is thinking. My experience revealed something profound in those first hours that I would spend 10 years confirming. The being I had found operated in a cognitive register that was categorically different from any animal I had rehabilitated. It processed situations. It evaluated relationships. It made decisions based on observed evidence rather than purely on instinct or fear. It was, in some fundamental way, that my training had not prepared me for a person. I did not sleep that first night. I sat in the treatment room and watched it breathe and tried to figure out what I had done. By the third day, I had made 3 decisions. The first was medical. The injury was healing, the dehydration was resolved, and the infant was taking soft food, mashed fruit primarily, which it accepted with a skepticism that reminded me of a particularly opinionated toddler. It was going to survive. The second was practical. I could not return it to where I had found it. 3 days had passed. If the mother had been in the area, the absence of her infant for 3 days, combined with my obvious human scent on the site, would have communicated something irreversible. A return to the depression under the spruce was not a reunion. It was abandonment in a different location. The third decision was the one that changed everything. I did not report it. I have been asked about this decision many times in my own mind, and I want to explain it as accurately as I can, because it was not a simple decision, and it was not made lightly, and it was made by a man who had spent 22 years operating within the professional and legal frameworks of licensed wildlife rehabilitation and understood exactly what he was stepping outside of. What most people don't understand about the wildlife rehabilitation community is how completely ill-equipped the regulatory framework is for edge cases. I had a legal obligation to report significant wildlife findings to the state. I had no legal category for what I had found. Reporting it meant, and I thought through this carefully, surrendering it to an institutional process that had no protocol for it, had no facility appropriate for it, and would, in the most likely scenario, result in its transfer to a research context for which it had not consented and from which it would not benefit. I had raised enough bears to know what happened to wild animals that entered the institutional pipeline without a clear rehabilitation pathway. I had filled out enough paperwork on animals that didn't make it through that pipeline. I kept it. I kept silent. I named it Rue. I wrote in my journal, I know this is wrong in at least 3 ways. I am doing it anyway. I am asking the world to hold me accountable for that later. Rue was, in those first months, simultaneously the most demanding and the most astonishing being I had ever cared for. The physical demands were significant. By July 1994, 2 months in, Rue had gained 8 pounds and was eating approximately 4 times what the equivalent weight bear cub consumed. A diet that I assembled through trial and error, beginning with soft fruits and cooked grains and expanding as the digestive system proved robust, to include raw vegetables, nuts, fish, and eventually meat, which Rue accepted with a focused enthusiasm that was the most purely animal thing about the experience. Sleep was complicated. Rue was accustomed to sleeping in physical contact with another warm body, and in the absence of that body, woke frequently and with a distress that was, by any reasonable assessment, grief. I solved this, imperfectly, by sleeping in the treatment room for the first 6 weeks. which helped, but did not fully resolve the problem. What eventually helped was warmth and weight, a specific combination of blankets that approximated the pressure and temperature of a larger body. And even then, Rue woke twice a night on average until October. My observations consistently showed that Rue's behavioral development moved at a pace that had no analog in any large mammal I had worked with, and that tracked more closely, and though not identically, with human infant development than with ape development. The social sophistication arrived early and accelerated fast. By 3 months in, Rue had a vocabulary of sounds that were clearly communicative, each with consistent meaning. A particular low sound for food, a different one for discomfort, a third for, and I am going to use this word carefully, companionship. A sound that meant, come be near me. A sound that had no survival function. A sound that was purely social. Here's why this changed everything for me in those early months. That sound, the companionship sound, was directed at me. Not at the blankets, not at the building. At me, specifically, when I left the room and when I returned. Rue had formed a bond with me of the kind that primates form with caregivers, a bond built on the consistent experience of being fed, warmed, and comforted by the same individual. And within the framework of that bond, Rue treated me with a trust that I had done nothing to deserve and everything to earn. I have never felt more responsible for anything in my life. By the end of 1994, Rue and I had built something that I can only describe as a shared language, not words. Rue had no human words, and I was not arrogant enough to try to teach them, but a system of sound and gesture and spatial relationship that allowed us to communicate with surprising precision. Rue's sound vocabulary expanded to approximately 30 distinct vocalizations by the 12-month mark. I documented each one in my journals with as much phonetic precision as I could manage, along with the context in which each appeared and the responses that seemed consistent with the intended meaning. Some were transparent, the alarm sound, the hunger sound, the play invitation. Others required weeks of observation to decode. One sound, low, sustained, with a particular quality I eventually described in my journal as deliberate, appeared in a specific context. When Rue was watching me do something it hadn't seen before, it was the sound of paying attention to a new thing, the sound of learning. My experience revealed something profound in documenting that sound. Rue was not simply habituating to its environment, it was studying it. It was applying systematic observation to every new object, new process, and new behavior it encountered, bringing the same patient, methodical attention to the wood stove that it brought to the truck engine that it brought to the act of me reading a book. Everything was data. Everything was being filed. The way Rue observed me, calculating, deciding how to approach, wasn't merely animalistic. It was the behavior of a being engaged in a continuous project of understanding, applying intelligence to the task of mapping an unfamiliar world with the thoroughness of a scientist and the intimacy of a child. By June 1995, 1 year in, Rue stood approximately 4 feet tall and weighed, by my estimate, 90 pounds. The reddish infant hair had darkened to a deeper auburn, thicker and coarser, covering more of the face. The eyes had deepened in color, darker amber, with flecks of something almost green in certain light. The proportional difference from a human child was becoming more pronounced. The arms longer, the shoulders broader, the jaw heavier, the hands Those hands that had been oversized even as an infant, now genuinely remarkable, capable of a grip strength I had occasion to measure once, when Rue grabbed a fence post in a moment of alarm and left a compression mark in the wood. I measured Rue's height on the doorframe of the treatment room every month. I still have the marks. The next 7 years, 1995 through 2002, were the years of Rue's growing, and they were the most extraordinary years of my life. I want to resist the temptation to sentimentalize them, because sentimentality would be a disservice to their actual texture, which was difficult and strange and often overwhelming and also undeniably wondrous. Every year brought new capacities, new challenges, new moments that required me to rewrite my understanding of what I was living with. At age 3, Rue demonstrated tool use for the first time. Not the simple tool use of a crow or a sea otter, but deliberate multi-step tool modification. A branch identified and selected from a pile of firewood, stripped of its smaller offshoots, used as a lever to move a feed barrel that Rue wanted repositioned. The selection, the modification, the application, each step purposeful. I watched it happen from the barn door and wrote in my journal that night. It planned this. It saw the problem, identified the solution, and implemented it in sequence. I need to reconsider everything I thought I understood about the upper bound of this. At age 5, Rue began what I can only call instruction, showing me things. Not in the urgent, alert way of an animal detecting a threat, but in the deliberate, attentive way of a being that has something to communicate and is working out how to communicate it. Rue would bring objects to my attention, a particular stone, a section of bark, a feather, looking from the object to me and back with a specific expectation of engagement. What Rue was communicating was not always clear to me. What was clear was the expectation. Look at this. Think about this. Tell me what you think. What most people don't understand about living in close daily contact with a highly intelligent non-human being for years is how completely it recalibrates your own self-perception. You cannot maintain the comfortable assumption of human cognitive supremacy in the presence of something that regularly demonstrates capacities you don't have. A spatial memory that made mine look like a rough sketch, a sensitivity to environmental change that bordered on the precognitive, a patience that made my own version of that virtue look like a performance of patience rather than the real thing. Rue did not make me feel less. Rue made me feel like I had been living in a very small room and had suddenly been shown the building. By 2001, 7 years in, Rue stood 6 feet 8 inches. I measured against the barn door, and weighed somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds by my best estimate. Based on what I knew about the biomechanics of the frame I was observing, the auburn had fully darkened to a deep brown black. The face, which had retained something almost delicate in the infant years, had broadened into the architecture I associated with the adult of the species. Pronounced brow, wide jaw, deep-set eyes. Rue no longer fit in the house without modification. We had long since moved the primary living space to the barn, which I had converted over several years into something that could reasonably be called comfortable for a large, highly intelligent being with specific preferences about temperature, light, and the arrangement of space. Rue arranged things. That was one of the things I had not expected. The aesthetic preferences. the specific place where a certain stone had to go, the way the light from the east window was better for certain activities than others. Here's why this changed everything for me as a reflection on what Rue was. Those preferences were not random. They were not habitual in the simple animal sense of behavior grooved by repetition. They were chosen, actively, deliberately, revisited, and sometimes revised. Rue had opinions, not survival-relevant preferences, but genuine aesthetic opinions, the kind that serve no purpose except the purpose of being the being that you are. I want to be honest about the cost of the secret, because I think sanitizing it would be its own kind of dishonesty. Maintaining Rue's concealment for 10 years required a restructuring of my entire life that I did not fully anticipate when I made the original decision, and that accumulated year by year into something significantly heavier than I had bargained for. I stopped having overnight visitors in 1995. I stopped having any visitors by 1997. I managed this through the ordinary social mechanics of a rural person who works alone. People leave you alone if you don't invite contact. And in northern Idaho, that is not considered unusual. I became known in Elk City as the quiet guy on the forest boundary who kept to himself and whose property was posted no trespassing. And I received, in exchange for that posting, the privacy that kept Rue safe. I stopped attending the state wildlife rehabilitators conferences in 1998, ending relationships with colleagues I had maintained for 15 years. I could not attend a conference about wildlife rehabilitation while running, on my own property, the most significant wildlife rehabilitation situation in the history of the field, undisclosed. The cognitive dissonance was too acute. I spent money I had not budgeted, on food primarily, because feeding Rue required quantities that a human alone could not justify, and on the barn modifications and on the additional land buffer I purchased to the east in 1999, specifically to create a larger zone of privacy around the property. My observations consistently showed that Rue was aware of the concealment, not of the specific social mechanics involved, but of the underlying situation. Rue knew that the arrangement we had required privacy. This was demonstrated repeatedly in the way Rue monitored the property perimeter. A daily patrol of the fence line that I had not taught and had not requested, and that began spontaneously around age 4 and continued without interruption until the very end. Rue knew something needed protecting, and Rue protected it. That broke something in me every time I thought about it. The child protecting the secret of its own existence because the alternative was too dangerous to contemplate. Here's why this changed everything for me as a moral reckoning. I had made a decision in 4 minutes in a cold forest in May 1994 that had restructured 2 lives, mine and Rue's, in ways I had not fully foreseen. Rue had not consented to concealment. Rue had not consented to domesticity. Rue had not consented to any of it because at the beginning, consent wasn't possible. And by the time it might have been, the situation had its own momentum that I could not see clearly from inside it. I am not telling you I was wrong. I am telling you I am not sure I was right, and that the difference between those 2 things is smaller than I once believed. In the late summer of 2004, something changed. I noticed it first in Rue's behavior, a shift so subtle that I might have missed it in a less observed animal, but that stood out against 10 years of close daily contact, the way a change in a familiar voice stands out even when you can't immediately name what's different. Rue began ranging to the eastern perimeter more frequently. Not the regular patrol, something additional, specific, directional, always the same section of fence line, the northeast corner, where the property abutted the deepest section of national forest. Rue would stand at that corner sometimes for hours and look into the trees with the focused, still attention I associated with long-distance sensory processing. Not alarm, not fear, something closer to recognition. By September 2004, I had noted the behavioral change in my journal 14 separate times. I had also noticed something else, a smell arriving on the wind from the northeast on certain mornings that was animal and complex in the way Rue's own scent was animal and complex, but different, older, heavier, with a depth that suggested a much larger body. My experience revealed something profound in those weeks that I should have understood more quickly than I did. Rue was not discovering something new. Rue was recognizing something known. The posture at the fence line was not the posture of an animal detecting an unfamiliar presence. It was the posture of a being who had detected something it had been, at some level below my visibility, waiting for. I wrote in my journal on September 23, 2004, "Something is coming. Rue knows what it is. I need to figure out what I'm going to do." I did not figure it out in time. October 9, 2004. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees overnight. A Friday. I remember the date with the completeness that you remember dates that divide your life into before and after. I was in the barn with Rue at approximately 11 at night. We often spent evenings together, a habit built over 10 years that I had no intention of breaking, when Rue went completely, absolutely still. Not the stillness of sleep, the stillness of every system in a large body being redirected to a single purpose: listening. I did not hear anything for approximately 30 seconds. Then I heard it, a sound that I had been told in 22 years of wildlife work did not exist. A sound that had no place in the catalog of any animal native to northern Idaho. A sustained, resonant vocalization, deep enough to feel in the chest, complex enough to carry something I could only call emotional content, that came from the direction of the northeast fence line. Rue answered. I had heard Rue vocalize 10,000 times in 10 years. I had never heard the sound Rue made in that moment. It was nothing like any of the 30-odd vocalizations in my journal. It was longer, more complex, with a cadence that, even without a shared language to parse it, communicated something I recognized immediately, viscerally, without needing to decode it at all. It was the sound of a child answering its mother. Here's why this changed everything for me in one moment. I had spent 10 years constructing an understanding of Rue as the central fact of my world, and in the 30 seconds of that exchange, I understood, fully, finally, without any buffer of self-deception, that Rue's central fact was something I had been standing in front of the whole time. The door to the barn was on the south side. I moved to the window on the north side and looked out. She was at the fence. She was not what the stories describe. The stories describe something monstrous, a thing of pure threat, of undifferentiated rage, of the wilderness made aggressive. What I saw at my fence line at 11 o'clock on a Friday night in October was something more terrible than that, and more human than that. And the combination was the most frightening thing I have ever experienced. She was enormous. I will not minimize that. Where Rue at 10 years old stood approximately 7 feet and pushed 500 pounds by my estimate, the figure at the fence line was larger in every dimension. 8 feet minimum, probably more, with a mass that was evident even in the darkness, in the way that mass is evident when it moves and the ground responds. The coloring was darker than Rue's, closer to black than brown, with gray at the face and the shoulders in the way of age rather than genetics. But what I keep returning to when I recall that night is not the size. What most people don't understand about an encounter with a being of that intelligence and that capacity for grief is that the fear it produces is not the fear of a predator. It is a different and more disorienting fear, the fear of a moral situation you have no framework for. She was not displaying aggression in the way a bear displays aggression, or an elk, or any animal I had managed in 22 years. She was not threatening me. She was standing at my fence with her hands on the top rail, looking at the barn, and she was shaking. Not with cold, not with aggression, with something I can only call grief. The full body, uncontrolled shaking of a being that has been carrying something for a very long time and has just, at last, arrived at the place where it can be set down. She had been looking for Rue for 10 years. I stood at the barn window for approximately 4 minutes, long enough to understand what was happening, long enough to understand what I needed to do. I opened the barn door. Rue was behind me, not pressed against me, not hiding, but close, in the way Rue was close when something significant was being processed. I could feel the warmth of that large body at my shoulder, and I could hear the breathing, which was faster than usual and slower than alarm. I stepped out of the barn. I walked toward the fence. I want to be precise about what I felt on that walk because I think the feeling is important. I was not brave. Bravery implies a choice made despite fear, and what I felt was not coherent enough for a choice. I walked toward the fence because the alternative, staying inside, keeping Rue inside, trying to outlast or avoid or manage this situation, was not actually an alternative. She had traveled over however many years and however many miles to this fence. She was not going to leave without what she had come for. And Rue, I understood with a certainty that bypassed conscious reasoning, was not going to ask me to try. She looked at me when I stopped at the fence. Her eyes were not the amber of Rue's eyes. They were darker, closer to brown, with the depth of something that has observed a very great deal. She looked at me the way you look at a situation you have been thinking about for years, with total comprehension and total intensity, and underneath both of those things, an exhaustion that was almost physical in its visibility. My experience revealed something profound at that fence line. She was not furious in the simple sense of the word. She was not operating from rage alone. What she was operating from was something more complex and more devastating. The controlled, purposeful intensity of a mother who has been searching for her child for 10 years and has finally found not the child alone, but the child and the reason the child was kept. She looked at me. She looked past me, at the barn, at the large shadow visible in the open doorway. She made a sound I will never be able to describe adequately, low, brief, with a directional quality, aimed at the barn, at Rue, at the specific point where 10 years of distance collapsed. Rue answered, and then Rue walked out of the barn. I stepped back. I went to the fence rail, put my back to it and stayed there. What happened in the next 20 minutes is not mine to describe in detail because it was not mine. It belonged to them, to the reunion of a mother and her child across a decade of separation, conducted in a language I did not speak and could not fully witness and should not have been present for at all, except that the geography didn't allow for my absence. What I will say is this: the sounds that accompanied those 20 minutes are with me still. They are not the sounds I would have predicted. There was no simple joy in them, no uncomplicated reunion of the kind you might see in a wildlife documentary, the mother and cub tumbling together in evident relief. What the sounds communicated, and I am aware that I am interpreting a language I don't speak, and I am offering this with appropriate humility, was more complex than that. There was recognition. There was something that I can only call reckoning, not accusation, but the patient establishing of what had happened and how and why. There were long silences. There was, at certain points, a sound I had heard from Rue 100 times in 10 years. The low, sustained vocalization that Rue made when working through something difficult. It was different in the mother, heavier, older, carrying more weight, but recognizably the same sound. They were talking through what had happened. They were taking the time to understand it. My observations consistently showed me something in that 20 minutes that I have spent 19 years trying to hold on to. That these beings brought the same patient, methodical intelligence to the hardest emotional situations that they brought to everything else. There was no hysteria. There was no violence. There was the difficult, sustained work of two people who had been separated for a decade by circumstances neither had fully controlled, finding each other again with the thoroughness that a genuine reunion requires. When it was over, when the sound stopped, and the two figures stood together in a silence that had the quality of something completed, the mother looked at me. I am going to try to describe that look accurately because it is the most important thing I have to report. She looked at me for a long time, not with rage, and I want to be careful here because the word is easy and the reality was more complex. With forgiveness, exactly. With something that encompassed both of those things and exceeded them, the way a landscape encompasses both its features and the air above them. What most people don't understand about a moment of accountability before a being of that intelligence is that it cannot be managed or navigated or survived through the ordinary human strategies, the explanations, the justifications, the framing. She did not want my explanation. She had arrived at my fence with a decade of evidence and drawn her own conclusions. And her conclusions were, I believed, accurate. She knew what had happened. She knew Rue had been injured and unable to move, and that I had intervened, and that the intervention had, in a narrow biological sense, been the right one. She also knew what the intervening 10 years had been, what Rue had missed, what Rue's development had occurred alongside and in place of, what the concealment had cost both of us. She knew I had loved Rue. She knew that was true and complicated and not, on its own, sufficient. The look contained all of this. It was the look of a being that had processed a complex moral situation with full intelligence and arrived at a verdict that was neither simple condemnation nor simple absolution, because the situation didn't warrant either. It was the look of someone who understood exactly what you had done and was choosing to let you live with it. Here's why this changed everything for me as a final reckoning. I had spent 10 years telling myself in the quiet of the barn and the journal entries and the long evenings with Rue, that what I had done was right. Not entirely right. I knew it wasn't entirely right, but right enough, justified enough, defensible enough to live with. In 30 seconds of that look, I understood that justification was not the relevant framework. The relevant framework was consequence. And the consequence of my 4-minute decision in a cold forest in 1994 was a 10-year absence in the life of a being who had spent those 10 years searching. I had no adequate response to that. I still don't. I need to tell you what happened next with complete honesty, because it is the part of the story that is most important and most easily romanticized, and I will not romanticize it. Rue came to me, not immediately. After the reunion with the mother, after the sounds and the silences and the long work of being found again, Rue moved across the yard and stood before me in the way Rue had stood before me 10,000 times over 10 years and looked at me with those deep amber eyes. I did not speak. I had nothing to say that was not inadequate. Rue put one hand briefly on my shoulder, the large, warm, extraordinary hand of a being who had grown from a 25-pound infant to something larger than most rooms I had lived in my house, in my barn, over 10 years of my life. Then Rue stepped back. I understood what the step back meant. I had understood it before Rue made it, the way you understand things that you have been preparing for without knowing you were preparing. Rue was going. Rue was choosing to go, not because the 10 years had been wrong, not because the bond between us had been false, but because Rue's story had never been only mine. It had always been larger than the property I owned and the barn I had converted and the journals I had filled. Rue had a mother who had searched for a decade. Rue had a species, a community, a world that was not my world and had never been. What I had given Rue was 10 years. What I was giving Rue now was the door. They left before dawn. I did not follow. I stood in the yard in the cold, and I listened to the sound of them moving through the northeast fence line into the national forest until there was no sound left to listen to. I have not changed what I built for Rue. I have thought about it many times, and I have not done it. The modifications to the barn are still there. The reinforced door frame, the specific sleeping arrangement that took me 3 years to get right, the east-facing window that Rue preferred for morning light. The feed supply is obviously no longer current, but the structure of the space remains. I go in there sometimes, not often, but sometimes when the weight of what I know needs to be held somewhere other than my own interior. My experience revealed something profound in the years since October 2004 that I think is the true conclusion of this story, if it has one, that the most significant relationship of my life produced a loss that I have no conventional framework for grieving. Rue was not my child in any legal sense. Rue was not a pet in any honest sense. Rue was something for which the language of human relationships is insufficient, a being I raised and loved and was educated by, and who chose correctly to leave. What most people don't understand about that kind of loss is that it cannot be resolved through the ordinary mechanisms of grief, through time, through acceptance, through the gradual fading of the specific and the remaining comfort of the general. The specific does not fade. The memory of Rue's hand on my shoulder on the last night is as precise as the memory of the sound of the elbow joint reducing on the first night, they are equally vivid because they were equally real. And reality, I have discovered, does not diminish with distance. I am not telling you this so you will feel sorry for me. I made every decision that led to this outcome, beginning with the one in 4 minutes in a cold forest in 1994. I am telling you this because the loss is part of the story, and the story is not only mine, and the part of the story that is mine deserves to be told honestly rather than in a way that makes me look better than I was. I have thought over 19 years about what to extract from this experience as something useful, something that could be communicated to someone who was not there, and that would mean something to them. I have been reluctant to do this because the experience was not mine to reduce to lessons, and any lessons I extract are inevitably filtered through my own perception of events that involved beings whose interior experience I cannot fully access. But I will try, because trying is the only honest response I have left. The first thing I learned is about intelligence. We have spent the history of our species constructing a hierarchy of mind that places human cognition at the apex and everything else below it in descending order. Rue dismantled that hierarchy not through any single dramatic demonstration, but through 10 years of consistent, patient, comprehensive intelligence that operated in ways mine did not and could not. Rue remembered things I forgot. Rue sensed things I missed. Rue solved problems I was stuck on. Rue was patient in situations where I was not. The hierarchy is a convenience, not a fact. And it is a convenience that costs us an accurate perception of what else is alive in our world. The second thing I learned is about love. I loved Rue. That is not a complicated statement, and I am not going to make it complicated. I loved Rue the way you love anything that you have kept alive and watched grow and been educated by and given your daily attention to for 10 years. And what that love revealed to me, in its deepest moments and its most difficult ones, is that love is not diminished by difference. The fact that Rue and I could not fully communicate, could not share a language or a culture or a species history, did not diminish what existed between us. It may have deepened it in the way that the effort required to bridge a significant gap can deepen the bridge's meaning. The third thing I learned is about accountability. The mother at the fence line, with her decade of searching and her look that contained everything, taught me something that I had believed intellectually for my entire adult life, but had not, until that moment, understood in my body, that consequences are real, regardless of intentions. I intended, in 1994, to save a life. I did save a life. I also interrupted a family, concealed information from a community, and made 10 years of decisions on behalf of beings who had not authorized me to make them. All of those things are simultaneously true. Accountability does not erase intention. It does not pretend that the consequences were what you intended. It looks at what actually happened and stands in front of it without flinching. The fourth thing I learned is about wilderness. I have spent 40 years in relationship with the wild country of northern Idaho, and I believed, going into this experience, that I understood it well. I understood its ecology, its wildlife, its seasonal patterns, its dangers, its rewards. What I did not understand, what 10 years with Rue and one night with Rue's mother revealed, is how much of that country I had been navigating with a map that was missing most of its features. There are beings in the wilderness that our official accounts of it do not include, moving through it with a depth of knowledge and relationship that makes our best wildlife science look like a first approximation. We are not the most aware presence in the forest. We are in many ways the least aware. That is not an insult. It is an invitation. I am 61 years old. I still own the 43 acres. The national forest is still on 3 sides. The northeast fence line is still there. I do not expect Rue to come back. I think the choice that was made on that October night in 2004 was real and complete. And I think Rue is where Rue belongs, in a world I was never part of and never should have tried to be. But I hope, and this is the most honest thing I can offer at the end of this account, I hope that Rue is well. I hope that the 10 years of domesticity and concealment did not damage something that cannot be repaired. I hope that the mother's decade of searching ended in a reunion that was, for both of them, adequate to the distance it had to cross. I hope that Rue carries forward from our years together, not the loss of what those years cost, but whatever was genuinely given, the care, the attention, the 10 years of daily evidence that one member of the human species could be trusted to show up consistently in the service of something other than itself. What most people don't understand is that the story I have told you is not a story about a cryptid. It is not a story about an encounter with the unknown. It is a story about what happens when you are given responsibility for something you cannot fully understand and choose to accept it anyway, and what you learn in the process, and what it costs, and what it gives, and how those two things are not in balance, how the cost exceeds the giving in some measures, and the giving exceeds the cost in others, and how you learn to live with the arithmetic of that without pretending it resolves. My experience revealed something profound that I believe is the last thing I have to say, that the beings I lived with and alongside in those 10 years in a barn in northern Idaho were more like us than we have allowed ourselves to believe. And that belief, the deliberate self-serving belief in our own singularity, is the thing most worth examining, not because it is strategically wrong, not because it leads to bad policy or poor science, though it does both of those things, but because it is lonely, because the world is full of minds, and we have spent our history refusing to notice most of them, and that refusal has made us lonelier than we needed to be. The barn is still there. The marks on the door frame are still there. Every monthly measurement, from 25 pounds to 500 in pencil, dated, a record of something that happened and that I will not pretend away. Rue existed. The mother existed. That night at the fence existed. I am the only one left who can say that, and so I have said it. Whatever you do with it is up to you.